But one of the things that has consistently come up in all the 19 years that I've been working with the Rohingya community is when you talk with elders, they often refer back to this time in World War II where the Rohingya helped serve for the British.
Hello and welcome to episode 36 of What's Happening in Myanmar, a weekly show from the Frontier Myanmar podcast family. I'm your host, Luke Corbin. Today, I'm joined by Greg Constantine, a documentary photographer and project lead for a new exhibition on Rohingya identity and belonging, which is currently on show in Chiang Mai. We'll be talking about that and more momentarily, but first, I'm going to cover the biggest news this week, which is the fall of Nawnghkio to the military. That strategic town of Nawnghkio has been held by the Ta'ang National Liberation Army, the TNLA, since last year. Nawnghkio sits on an important crossroads between Punulwin and the road to the Chinese border, and the TNLA's success at taking the town, as part of Operation 1027, originally led to speculation and excitement that anti-military armed groups could even threaten Mandalay. That spirit soon dried up as the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army folded to Chinese pressure and handed Lashio back to the military. The military then intensified its slow crawl back up the Nawnghkio road, eventually taking back the whole town yesterday, though fighting continues in villages close by to the west. As you might recall from episode 31 of this podcast, the TNLA was attempting to institutionalize a new administration system in Nawnghkio and elsewhere, and it still controls significant land nearby from the previous offensives. The TNLA still controls two major towns on the road between Lashio and Nawnghkio, that's Jalbme and Shipo, but they are now looking increasingly vulnerable. With Nawnghkio and Lashio back in the military's hands, the incredible losses the military suffered during Operation 1027 appear to be slowly being reversed, with the military on the ascent, with intent to retake control of the northern Shan State trade route into China. The TNLA is reportedly ordering people not to use internet devices in Jalbme Township, and some residents of Jalbme are already fleeing, anticipating the next round of fighting. In February this year, China brokered ceasefire talks between the State Administration Council, SAC, and the TNLA. And one of the SAC's demands at the time was that TNLA return Nawnghkio to the military, which the TNLA refused. The two sides are scheduled to meet again in August, most likely in the Chinese city of Kunming, where previous talks took place. Now, quickly before introducing Greg, we all remember the awful Sagaing earthquake of March 28th. The consequences of that disaster continue, with people living and working under tarpaulins in shipping containers, and whole city blocks still hang in the balance, waiting for repair or demolition. This week, Frontier released a feature story about the dangers of shoddy reconstruction in quake-affected areas. Corruption and a lack of building materials means that, unfortunately, cities are not building back better. Check out that feature story on the Frontier website. And now, over to Greg.
So barely an episode really goes by of this podcast without some story on the plight of the Rohingya. Over 1 million Rohingya refugees are currently stuck in camps in Bangladesh, and their homelands in Myanmar are riven by conflict. Rakhine State now has communication blackouts, a lack of basic services, even banknotes are in short supply there. It's far too dangerous for many to return home, and yet conditions in the Bangladesh camps are barely livable. On Friday, the United Nations Refugee Agency actually said that essential services are at risk of collapsing in the camps unless more money is urgently found. Rohingya people have for years tried to escape either Myanmar or Bangladesh, escape to third countries by sea, dangerous trips with low survival rates. And even if they successfully make it to a country like India, Indonesia or Malaysia, there are few guarantees for Rohingya people's safety there. UN-registered Rohingya refugees actually risk being entrapped and deported inhumanely from India, as has happened this year, and host communities in Indonesia and Malaysia are also increasingly hostile towards Rohingya refugees. But all of this, crucially, this current situation in 2025, it's actually just the latest in a long line of indignities that Rohingya communities have endured since the founding of Burma in 1948. Greg Constantine has been photographing Rohingya individuals and communities for 19 years and has visited the camps in Bangladesh over 25 times. He is a tireless advocate for Rohingya history and resistance against the narratives that seek to destabilise Rohingya identity and Rohingya belonging to the Myanmar nation-state. He's here in Chiang Mai right now with a new exhibition, Ek Khaale, which means Diyanyo Akal, once upon a time. It's currently showing at the French Institute opposite EFEO on Charoen Pratet Road in Chiang Mai. The exhibition features original documents and photographs to tell the stories of the Rohingya community. And it's my pleasure to introduce you, Greg. Hello.
Hi, how are you? It's great to see you. Thanks so much, Luke.
Yeah, of course. Now, Greg, you were deeply involved in photographing the Rohingya exodus from Rakhine State in 2017. Your photos are part of the historical record of that tragedy, which the United States, of course, called an act of genocide. But being terrorised, having your home burned, being pushed out of your country, this isn't the only way that genocide occurs. So what's happened to the Rohingya community in Myanmar to get us to the horrors of 2017 and today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when you're looking at kind of like the process, for most people, the definition of genocide would be something that happens spontaneously, just all of a sudden a burst of spontaneous violence that then results in the physical death of countless amount of people with a purpose for destroying or eliminating a group of people because of the characteristics of who they are. But also at the same time, I think that there's something that a lot of people don't particularly pay much attention to, don't particularly realize, and definitely the media doesn't spend really any time trying to help kind of unpack. And that is that most of these situations, there's something that are protracted over years and years and years and years, that this is not a burst of spontaneous violence, that it's something that actually there's a process involved. And oftentimes that has to deal with the weakening of a community, the demonizing of a community, the degradation of their legal status within a particular country, however fragile that legal status might be for anyone in that country, i.e. Myanmar. So that happened over a course of several decades with the Rohingya community, from the isolation to kind of like an apartheid-like existence, to the segregation of the community from other communities, from the lack of legal status, to all these different tactics that were taken on the ground in terms of the arbitrary application of laws or even informal orders that were taking place, like the inability to travel from one village to the next, the inability to get married without having to pay exorbitant amounts of bribes and going through a humiliating process. All these different things. It's a whole package of kind of characteristics that then produced this moment which then occurred in 2017, which most people in the world, that's their starting point for their understanding of the legacy of violence towards the Rohingya community is 2017. But what most people don't know is that it goes back 30, 40 years, this process has been taking place. And so in that process of the media, of Rohingya sharing pictures themselves, of the proliferation of social media, there's been an identity, a visual identity that's been created that represents the Rohingya community. And that's very much a product of what's happened to them, the abuses, the persecution, the violence against them, the mass displacement against them. All those optics have come to create this visual identity that represents the Rohingya community in the eyes of the world today, and also in the eyes of people from Myanmar. And that is a group of people who are desperate, are victims, are suffering, are refugees, are stateless people, are people without a home. And there is a degree of that's true in the sense that this is a community that has suffered. This is a community that has been on the receiving end of unquestionable amount of violence, both physical and like structural and invisible violence. But at the same time, that should not define who this community is. There's a long history of this community that most people have no idea about, that's actually been questioned, contested, and erased by successive Burmese regimes. And that's what this project is trying to do. It's trying to almost challenge both the visual representation that exists in the world today, but also this false narrative of this being a community that has never belonged to Burma, that came over from Bangladesh during colonial times, that have never contributed to the country and that are illegal residents. That is not true whatsoever. And this project tries to contribute something totally new to that conversation.
Well, let's talk about the show. I mean, it's called Once Upon a Time. I want to ask you, what does that title mean? And how does the show work? It's a visual exhibition primarily, right? Online and offline.
Yeah. I mean, the title Ek Khaale and Once Upon a Time, for a lot of people, particularly for the Rohingya community, but for people outside of maybe Myanmar or the Rohingya, Once Upon a Time has a translation of fables and fairy tales and things like this. But when you mention that word Ek Khaale to Rohingya, it actually is something that takes on a very different meaning. It's about talking about a specific period of time that is very, very meaningful, yet at the same time, it's painful to think about. That's what this project is all about. And so the title for the project came about by sitting around with a group of Rohingya guys in the camps and talking through questions, and finally one of them blurting out the word Once Upon a Time. And it was the perfect kind of gift for me as a visual storyteller working on a project like this, because it encapsulates, I think, every characteristic of this project, not also from my eyes, but also I think from the eyes of Rohingya and what they see with this project being and developing. So it's gone through a number of different phases from the development of the website, but here the exhibition, it's the first kind of physical manifestation of this project, which is really exciting because I'm an analog kind of thinker, and it's just, I really believe in the power of walls. And so it's been really rewarding to take all these materials over the past couple of years, particularly 2 years, and work with Rohingya to almost let the materials tell the stories rather than imposing a narrative that the pictures then feed into, and then finding these different ways of being able to tell it in the digital space online on the website, which is available in English and in Burmese language, and then being able to translate it on walls. And that's this is the first major exhibition. It's fantastic to have it here in Chiang Mai.
I was thinking about your exhibition away from the context comparatively, and I think it's kind of like, well, would you call it a community archive?
Absolutely. Yes. It's a great way of looking at it. I mean, archive can take on a number of different kind of meanings for people, in the sense that it can mean that it's just basically preservation, But I think that this is much bigger than just the way that most people would view archive. This is something to where it's a living, breathing kind of family album of who this community is, who they were at a particular time, and also at the same time, it's asking people to almost reimagine if none of this violence had ever happened against the Rohingya community over the past 50 years. This is the trajectory that community was on. And imagine where they would be now if none of this had happened. And also place it on top of if none of this had happened to anyone in Myanmar in terms of that sense. Because I think you can apply it to all communities, So there's an element of the Rohingya community have been so othered for so long, but this exhibition, this project, one of the powerful things about it is that it actually is presenting a space where other communities in Burma can find shared histories and share memories, and also a shared sense of solidarity at this very, very important time, I think, in Myanmar's history.
And of course, Ek Khaale is primarily a visual experience. That's not great for a podcast, but we will still talk about some of the exhibits that the Rohingya people volunteered for the exhibition. But okay, first, how did you actually put together this exhibition with its exhibits?
So it first started off with a curiosity instinct on my part. I wonder what Rohingya still possess. And I started reaching out to older Rohingya in different parts of the world, and they started sharing some things with me that almost confirmed this instinct. And then it developed into something that was much bigger. I started working with teams of Rohingya youth, men and women, in the camps in Bangladesh. There were 4 of them that were working, that I was collaborating with, who were still living inside of North Rakhine State, Mongdao, Butadong, and Sitwe. And some were floating back and forth between Sitwe and Yangon. And then kind of within the diaspora community across maybe 10 different countries, Canada, the United States, Ireland, Denmark, Malaysia, Australia. And really, the Rohingya themselves are the ones that have created this project. They were the ones that went out into their communities, to the families that they knew, and asked people, what do you have? And I think a lot of the younger Rohingya really had no idea what the community still had possessed, given all of the violence and the displacement in 2017. And so as they were going through this process of finding and asking people for these materials, Rohingya, the team members were really amazed by what they were finding and what they were seeing. And so that then led to this enormous collection of visual materials, from old ID cards to old, ripped land documents from the late 1800s, to family photographs, which we all have, regardless of where you live in the world, to voter registration cards, political participation cards, diaries, letters. I mean, all those kinds of things that show, when you put them all together, like the identity of a community. At the same time, simultaneously, I had an academic fellowship, which allowed me to live in London for a whole entire year. And I was doing deep research into a number of private and public archives: the British Library, Kew, the Royal Asiatic Society, the Bangladesh National Archives, the the Library of Congress. And so that produced a whole nother layer of materials. And all of that has kind of crystallized together to create what is the project right now.
Fantastic. Okay, let's talk about some of the themes in the exhibits. I thought we could start with Burma's independence. Listeners will probably know that Burma was founded in 1948 after the end of World War II, and that during that war, Japan occupied much of the country, and there was heaps of conflict between the British and many other armies fighting either for or against the Japanese. Now, you've got exhibitions on Rohingya participation in the struggle against the Japanese and their cooperation with the British in Arakan during World War II. These exhibits show the Rohingya right at the beginning of, the national foundation myth of the modern Myanmar nation state, in the same light as, the Karen and the Kachin and these other groups that fought with the British.
Yeah. I think that like with a lot of communities around the world, a lot of societies, a mythology is created about history, and that can easily be, manufactured, exploited, erased, and everything. But one of the things that has consistently come up in all the 19 years that I've been working with the Rohingya community is, when you talk with elders, they often refer back to this time in World War II where the Rohingya helped serve for the British. But yet at the same time, it's so obscure. You hear of the larger communities, the Karen, the Kachin, all contributing, taking that side during World War II, and all contributing to the liberation of Burma from the Japanese. But yet you never really hear anything about Arakan. And Arakan actually was the first major defeat of the Japanese in all of Burma, which then led to more defeats in Burma, which then led to the Japanese having to surrender in Burma. But Arakan was the starting point of all of that. And so this project is there to try to kind of demystify that. It took months and months and months of digging, of just pure serendipity, of finding materials that all synergize together, that create this piece of visual evidence that proves these kind of myths. And so through a series of different kind of strategies of what Rohingya were finding inside of Myanmar in Rakhine State, and what I was finding through my archival research while I was in London, we were able to find what I believe are the only existing visual photographs, documents that show and prove this important contribution that the Rohingya community, that men from the Rohingya community made in those war efforts. And so the importance of that is that it not just shows what one man might have done, but it shows a whole entire community of people who were helping in this effort. And that's a really important part of not only Burma's history, but world history. And the Rohingya were active participants in that. And that goes very much against the narrative that most people, I think, feel or have been told about this community over the past however many decades. So finding those materials were they were so crucial. They were a huge triumph for this project, because it was something that just really permanently placed visually the Rohingya in this key moment in Myanmar's history,
Yes. Right, and your exhibition actually, it goes way back into history, before the British Empire and Southeast Asia. But this section that we're talking about really anchors the Rohingya in that fiery crucible, those years that led to an independent Burma as a union, and all the dreams for ethnic autonomy and respect that ended up being dashed. It's hard for people to argue with, I think, this, that the Rohingya fought for the country as citizens.
Yeah, I think so too. I think what's so exciting about that example, but there's several others in this project that are equally important, but it's almost as if, like, history is a chain reaction of events that are one way or another attached to each other. One influences the other. And if I think back on it, I view it this way, that the Rohingya were part of the family of communities of Myanmar that were helping serve in the defeat of the Japanese. So there's a solidarity amongst the Rohingya with other communities in Burma, going back into the early 1940s. And then that results in the Japanese surrendering, which then leads to the next step, and that is the talk of an independent Burma, which then leads into the political organization of all the different parties and ethnic communities in Burma. And then that leads into the election of the Constituent Assembly. And that leads into the construction of the first constitution. And then Burma's independence. And then Burma as a new nation. And all of these things are all these key moments in that particular slice of Burma's history the Rohingya were active participants in. They were not passive bystanders. They were not people that just stood back. They were members of that community, just like every other community, that were actively involved in helping to develop this nation that became independent in 1948. And that's super exciting to be able to find the visual materials that support that kind of trajectory in history too.
Yeah. One example of this, of Rohingya in public life, that is, those decades after the independence, is the Rohingya public radio service that used to exist in Burma. It even broadcast a few years into the period after the first coup, after 1962. Amazingly, you actually interviewed someone who used to read the Rohingya news back then.
Yeah. So this would have been 2018. So it would have been a year after the mass exodus of Rohingya out of Rakhine State. And there's, roughly 900,000, almost a million Rohingya living in the refugee camps in southern Bangladesh. And I was introduced to a man, his name was Ershad Hussain. He was 105 years old when I met him. And he was, I met him and sat and talked with him in his hut within the masses in the refugee camps. And he was a really dignified elder man, almost like a statesman. You could just sense the wisdom coming off of this man. Not just wisdom in terms of intellectually, but just the wisdom of lived experience through life, because he'd experienced everything, really. When you think about modern, contemporary Burma history, he had been through it all to one extent or another. And, Rohingya, over all these years, one of the many things that they claim as being representative of their acceptance and their equality and their being a part and parcel to larger, wider Burma society is the inclusion of their language program within the family of language programs on Burma Broadcasting during the 1960s. I mean, language is one thing that identifies who a community is. And with Burma Broadcasting, it was the recognition of your language and the inclusion of it on the radio program said and spoke volumes. And as I was talking with Ershad Hussain in his hut, one of the reasons for talking with him, the primary reason, was that he was one of the original radio broadcasters on the Rohingya radio program. He was a living legacy. He was a living, piece of history right in front of, sitting in front of me. And he talked very fondly about those years, about how in the 1950s and the early 1960s, there was a sense of equality amongst all communities that obviously changed. But, here is an older man who really is a living piece of history sitting there telling his story. And I was just very, very privileged to be able to have the opportunity to talk with him. And then when we started this project, we were able to find all of these other archival materials that add on to his story. The announcement of the creation of the Rohingya radio program on the front page of the Nation newspaper back in 1961, or the inclusion of the Rohingya in the text of a 30th anniversary book that's at the SOAS Library in London that celebrates Burma broadcasting in its day. I mean, all of those things kind of distill down together to create a much deeper kind of story. And meeting Irshad was like one of the most important paragraphs or sentences of that paragraph of that particular time. So,
and there's a great photo of him in the exhibition, as well as examples of those documents that you mentioned. Actually, there's a lot of official documents in your exhibition, election results, identity cards, things like that. Many people in Myanmar put a lot of importance on these kinds of things, national registration cards, for example. And one of the things that many Rohingya have unfortunately experienced is having these cards confiscated by authority figures over the years. Of course, people also have lost a lot, just in general, from being displaced, at short notice, walking for long distances. But there's so much power in these official documents. That's what I want to ask you. The Rohingya who volunteered these to you have placed a lot of trust in you.
Yeah. I think that knowing what I knew about Burma being a heavily bureaucratic society, I mean, those are all things that were inherited by British colonial policies, that documents were pretty much everything. And the record keeping of things was vital for every single dimension of life. And that's not just for the Rohingya community, that's for everyone in Myanmar. And through this process of this particular project, I mean, what people have to also realize is that prior to the genocide of 2017, I mean, most of the Rohingya population were almost like locked away in this vacuum in North Rakhine State where nobody could ever get access to them or see anything. And also at the same time, I think that they were so heavily monitored and squeezed in terms of their surveillance that most people would never even show these kind of documents to anyone in North Rakhine State while they were living there for fear of what would happen to, even going back to the early 2000s, to Nasaka or the border guard or whatever. So one thing that did come with the genocide of 2017 is that it pushed hundreds of thousands of people out of this black hole. And with them, they carried these documents that finally were able to be exposed in a public space. And I've taken enough pictures of the suffering of the Rohingya community. But what's happening now is there's an opportunity actually to see these documents that people have told me about, that if you put them all together, tell a whole different kind of story about the existence of this community and also the strategies taken to persecute and degrade them and deny them their rights. And so in talking with Rohingya, one of the things is that it's amazing that they have kept so many of these old documents of their grandfathers, their grandparents, of their parents, given these waves of displacement that had taken place in the 1970s, in the 1990s, in the 2000s, confiscations of documents and everything. And so Rohingya know the importance and the value of these documents. And including them as part of this project was actually vital. Because these documents are a part of the storytelling process. Without them, we would only have to just go by word of mouth. And there's too many deniers out there. So it's like we have to show these kind of things. We have to show this evidence of existence that goes back as far as we possibly can, not of individuals, but entire families. And those entire families, when you put them together with other families, show an entire community. And so these old land documents, I mean, I was sitting in a room and an old man shared with me a land ownership document that was dated 1881, for a family and for his family in Mungdao. All of these things, when you put them together, present this really compelling story that challenges all these narratives. So the trust that Rohingya put not only in me, but in other Rohingya, primarily the Rohingya team members, was pretty incredible. But I think that one of the other things that's so interesting, when you ask Rohingya about the stories that they've told, most of the times, foreign journalists, researchers, NGOs, you name it, there's hundreds of them over the past, since 2017, have found their way into the camps. And most of the questions that Rohingya are being asked, and this is Rohingya telling me, are all about the violence that's been perpetrated against them. Tell us about what happened in 2017. Tell us about the death that you experienced. Tell us about, the loss that you've experienced, that you saw. No one, or very rarely, does anybody actually come into those camps and ask Rohingya about the life of their community and the history of their community. And when you started prompting Rohingya elders with those kind of questions, it was almost as if like they were so relieved and excited that somebody was coming in and asking them questions that they had never been asked before, and asking them for these pieces of material, visual materials that they had never been asked for before. Most of the Rohingya elders, when I would ask them, have you ever shared these materials with anybody else? Their response would be, nobody's ever asked for them.
Something less obscure and rather more intimate would be family photographs. These kinds of images. You've got heaps of those in the exhibition, quite amazing shots, really, of trendy young Rohingya in the 60s and 70s, groups of young people that honestly look like they could be in Tehran or Constantinople or something, listening to progressive rock, enjoying the fruits of working. But what do you hope people will take away from these many family scenes and individual portraits in the exhibition?
I think that Rohingya who have contributed materials to this project have been very excited about showing this other side of what the community looked like at a particular period of time and their place in history and their place in society. Rohingya are proud to be able to show my father was a judge. My grandfather and my uncle were both, policemen at a particular period of time. I mean, they're very, very proud of that because to have those positions, you had to be a government employee. And to be a government employee, you had to be a citizen of Myanmar. So all these things kind of show this deep sense of kind of pride that the Rohingya community had at this particular period of time, this golden age of Myanmar, particularly, like you said, from the 50s, 60s, and maybe early 70s, including academic life. Burma had the most prestigious academic system in all of Southeast Asia, and the Rohingya were part of that academic life. I think they're really proud of that. At least that's been the reaction that I've had. But I think going to your question about what I hope to achieve, I think it's what I hope to achieve, but it's also what the Rohingya who have contributed materials, more importantly, to this project, what they hope to achieve, And I think that is really about providing something that is completely and totally new and radical to the way that people see, view, and understand the Rohingya community in Myanmar's larger historical trajectory, that Rohingya were there in the streets in 1988 protesting with other communities and other students for democratic reforms. Rohingya were elected as members of parliament through almost all the elections that's been had since independence. There were middle-class Rohingya and upper-class Rohingya, just like every other community. And these family photographs are that visual translation of it. I mean, they're universal. I have pictures of my great-grandparents and my grandparents and my father and mother that look very similar to the ones that are up on the walls of the Rohingya community. I'm sure you do. I'm sure that I've found that as the exhibition has been open, there's been people who are from other ethnic communities from Myanmar walking into the exhibition, and their response is the same exact thing. So instead of identity being constructed and defined by difference, which is exactly what's happened to the Rohingya community for decades and decades and decades, let's try to create identity through something that's defined through similarity and universal traits. And that's where I think the power of these family photographs kind of accomplish that. I think that they do achieve that.
Yeah, well, you have worked really hard putting this show together. It's clear. You should be congratulated for it. But I do wonder if there's anything yet to be done. Do you have any goals you haven't achieved yet? Any stuff you're still working on in this exhibition?
Yeah, I think that there's so many things that still have to be accomplished with this project. I mean, it's almost infinite in a sense of not only the value that I think that it can contribute later on down the line, but you also see that there are big gaps in this project right now. I mean, I think one of the biggest gaps in this project is that it's the role of women within the larger Rohingya community historically going back. I mean, we can see photographs of groups of Rohingya students in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 70s that have women in them. But when you're really looking, and there's amazing photographs of women, but when it comes to the deeper kind of stories of women and their role, of Rohingya women in their role within the community and greater Burma society, they're very absent in that sense. And I really do feel like one of the objectives of the project is to hopefully be able to rewrite the role of women within the Rohingya community into that narrative. I think it's really important because I think there's some incredibly inspiring Rohingya women all around the world today who are advocating on behalf of their community. And there needs to be some kind of synchronicity between what was happening 50, 60 years ago and this particular project and how they can talk about it. So there's that. But I think moving forward, it's like, more exhibitions. I'm really trying to do as best I can to see that a book is published of this project so that there's something physical in the record that's bilingual that people can have and turn to, that will be in libraries. There's almost the creation of a digital archive because there's a website, but all these materials haven't really particularly found like a central home yet. So it's being able to find just a central home for all these materials where people can turn to and look at and research and stuff. So that's one of the objectives. And I think one of the other things is to, with the information that's coming from the Rohingya community itself, be able to develop strategic initiatives to how this project can better filter into the conversations that Rohingya are having amongst themselves and with others. Whether it be through education, through young, there's all sorts of young educational Rohingya-led groups all over the world, including in the camps. How can this project filter into their discussions? How can they discuss this kind of project themselves? They already are, but I know that there can be more. And all of that just requires time, capacity, funding, patience, and all of that. And I think it's pretty incredible what we've accomplished over the course of 5 years. This is never a project that could have come about in just only 1 year. So I'm invested into it in the long term, and I know Rohingya are invested in it into the long term. And I also hope that other people from Myanmar can also become invested in it in the long term as well, seeing how the project fits into all the important discussions that are taking place.
Yeah, awesome, Greg. This has been a really good chat. Want to ask you, though, before finishing, how long is the exhibition going to be sticking around for in Chiang Mai? And is it going anywhere else next?
The exhibition's up here in Chiang Mai until the end of the day on the 19th, Saturday the 19th of July. And then it'll be taken down, and then it will be sent to Dhaka in Bangladesh, where it will be on display from the 17th of August to the 28th of August. And then after that, it's anybody's guess where this will find walls next.
Well, I hope that listeners can catch it in either spot. Of course, it's beautiful here in Chiang Mai. It's in the old, nice wooden teak house, on the Alliance Francaise land there by the river. Highly recommended. Everyone drop by. In the show notes to this episode, I've put a link to the online version of the exhibition, which is, equally good. You can take it a bit more slowly and dip in and dip out. That's in English and the Burmese language version. Please do share that widely, especially within Myanmar-speaking communities. All right, that's that. Greg Constantine, thanks so much for coming on What's Happening in Myanmar.
Yeah, thanks so much, Luke. It's been a pleasure.
So if you're in Chiang Mai, you've still got a couple of days to catch that exhibition. Otherwise, of course, there's Dhaka. Now, I just wanted to say thanks for keeping up with what's happening in Myanmar. We love your questions and feedback on the show. You can always email us, whimyanmar@proton.me. And if you're in Bangkok and a Frontier member, don't forget that tomorrow there is a 10-year birthday bash in the city there. Check your email for the details and to RSVP. And then, of course, the following Friday on July 25, there will be similar events in Chiang Mai. So please check your email, come on down and have a 10-year anniversary party with the team at Frontier Myanmar. Okay, until then, until next week, farewell and take care.